There's a mask in this story that doesn't get worn for a very long time. It shows up in a film that isn't even the film we're here for tonight, in a mid-credits scene that plays not long after the movie ends, cradled in the hands of a cloaked figure kneeling beside a little boy. It's silver, old-looking, dented in places, a full faceplate with no eyes visible, because whoever is holding it out isn't holding it toward their own face. They're holding it toward the room. Inside that room is Sue Storm, reading to her young son, Franklin, at home in the Baxter Building, some time after the events of the movie you just watched. And she steps out for a moment, and when she comes back, she goes very still. That's it. That's the scene. No music sting, no dialogue, just a mask and a mother and a silence that the sound design leans into rather hard. And the reason that tiny moment matters to us tonight, lying here at whatever hour this is for you, is that it's the actual, literal, on-screen beginning of the film we're going to spend the next couple of hours talking around. Not the trailer, not the marketing, that nursery. That's where Doctor Doom walks into the Marvel Cinematic Universe. That's what we're doing tonight. We're talking about Avengers Doomsday, the film, the theories around it, the cast, the comics it's borrowing from, and a genuinely absurd amount of trivia about how it got made. All of it filtered through the fact that as of right now, the movie hasn't come out yet. It releases in December of 2026, which means everything I tell you tonight falls into one of 3 baskets. And I'm going to keep sorting things into those baskets out loud as we go. Because with a film like this, that's really the whole job. There's confirmed material, the things Marvel has put in trailers or said on a stage somewhere, which I'll treat as solid ground. There's my own reading of that material, which is just me thinking out loud, and you're welcome to disagree with me quietly into your pillow. And there's rumour and leak territory, which I'll flag every single time, because a pre-release Marvel video that blurs those 3 things together is, for my money, the single most annoying kind of video on this platform. And I'd rather bore you with a hedge than feed you something wrong. There's no ranking tonight, no countdown, no big theory saved for the end as a twist. I don't think that would suit the subject, even if I wanted it to, since the film itself hasn't happened yet. But there's no ending to build toward, regardless. Instead, think of it as a set of rooms in the same house. How the movie got its name, who's playing whom, what the trailers have actually shown us, as opposed to what a leak claims happens, what the comics this is drawn from actually say. A long stretch near the end that's just production trivia, which honestly might be my favourite part of the whole brief I put together for this. Each of those rooms stands on its own. Nothing in room 4 depends on you having stayed awake through room 2. So if you drift off somewhere in the middle, and at this hour I'd be a little surprised if you didn't, you haven't missed a payoff, because there isn't one waiting for you. That's rather the point of doing it this way. If you like this sort of thing, there's a subscribe button somewhere. No pressure, either way. That's the only time I'll mention it. Right, let's start with how we got here, because the story of how this film came to exist is honestly stranger and a little sadder in places than most of what's actually going to be on screen. For a long stretch of years, the plan for this exact release slot wasn't Doctor Doom at all. It was Kang. If you'd asked anyone paying attention back at San Diego Comic-Con in 2022, when this film was first announced, they'd have told you the next big Avengers movie was called Avengers the Kang Dynasty, that Jeff Loveness, who'd just written Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania, was scripting it, and that Destin Daniel Cretton, fresh off directing Shang-Chi, was attached to direct. Jonathan Majors had played versions of Kang in Loki and in Quantumania, and the studio was clearly building him toward being the next Thanos, the big unifying threat the whole slate would eventually orbit. That was the plan. It isn't the plan anymore, and the reason most people give for why is only half the story. Here's the part everyone remembers. Late in 2023, Jonathan Majors was convicted of assault, and Disney and Marvel dropped him within hours of the verdict. That's true, and it's the headline, and I'm not going to pretend it isn't the proximate cause of Kang disappearing from the release calendar. But here's a detail that tends to get flattened out of the popular version of this story, and it's worth being careful with because it changes the shape of the narrative a bit. Destin Daniel Cretton, the original director, actually left the project in November of 2023, a full month before that conviction. By his own account since, he'd mapped out a version of the film he described as really fun to work on, but he ultimately felt he wasn't the right fit for the direction Marvel wanted to take the story, and he moved on, eventually landing on directing Spider-Man Brand New Day instead. But the picture of Kang's story collapsing purely because of one man's criminal conviction isn't quite complete. There's reporting, and I want to be careful to flag this as reporting rather than a confirmed studio statement, that Marvel executives had already started cooling on Kang as the saga's next centerpiece villain before any of this happened, that the Majors situation accelerated a pivot that was already quietly forming rather than causing it outright. Whether that's entirely fair to Majors or not, I honestly don't know, and I don't think it's my place to adjudicate that here. But if you're the kind of viewer who likes the story to be precise rather than just satisfying, that's the more accurate version. Two separate problems, arriving close together, got merged into one clean narrative in the retelling, the way these things usually do. So what happened to the version of the film that had already been written? This is one of my favourite bits of trivia in the whole brief I put together for tonight, and I want to give it a proper amount of room, because it's the kind of detail you won't find in the trailer breakdowns. Only in interview transcripts nobody reads twice. Michael Waldron, Kiyoshimiu Agio de Kang Dynasty, depois da loveness ter sada do projeto, cantou pitch que os dois tinham imaginado juntos, que os Young Avengers chegava mesmo a derrota uma variante de Kang, para a equipa descobrir, depois da luta terminada, que aquele Kang, in particular, trazia consigo pequeno carto. And the card read, more or less, please be patient with him. It's his first day as a Kang. The direct callback to a gag from the post-credits scene of Quantumania, the so-called Lizard Kang, one of countless failed, half-formed variants of the character, glimpsed briefly in that Kang Council sequence. The idea was that some new, inexperienced Kang had wandered into a fight completely unprepared, hadn't even gotten his bearings yet, and the team beat him without much of a struggle at all. It's a genuinely funny image, a little bit sad too, honestly, in hindsight, given everything that happened afterward to the actor who was supposed to carry all of this. That whole storyline, card and all, was dropped along with the rest of the Kang-centered plan. It never got anywhere near a camera. What replaced it, revealed at San Diego Comic-Con in 2024, was a new title, Avengers Doomsday, a new director duo in Joe and Anthony Russo, the brothers who'd previously steered Captain America Civil War, Avengers Infinity War, and Avengers Endgame, and a new central villain in Doctor Doom. And then, in a separate reveal that I'll spend a proper chapter on later tonight, because it deserves one, Robert Downey Jr. was announced as the actor playing him. Jonathan Majors himself, for what it's worth, has since said publicly that he's heartbroken his version of Kang didn't get to continue, while also calling Doom, in his words, wicked, and leaving the door open to maybe playing Kang again someday. Marvel and the audience ever wanted that. I don't know what to make of that quote exactly. There's something a little melancholy in an actor rooting for the villain who replaced him, and something a little professional and gracious about it too. And I suspect both of those things are true at once. There's a phrase the Russo brothers have used to describe their own approach to coming back for this, and it's worth dwelling on for a second, because I think it tells you more about the film's ambitions than any plot detail could. They've described treating their return as going back to, in their words, Phase 0, not picking up the Marvel Cinematic Universe where it currently sits and adding one more chapter to an already very long book, but treating the whole thing as something closer to a foundational reset, rebuilding the scale and the stakes from the ground up the way the earliest Avengers films had to. That's an enormous claim for a studio to make about its own sequel, and normally I'd roll my eyes at that kind of marketing language on principle, but I'll admit the scale of what they're actually attempting, which we'll get into properly in a little while, at least makes the phrase feel earned rather than empty. Whether the finished film lives up to it is obviously not something I, or anyone else, outside a handful of editing bays, currently knows. Joe Russo has also talked, separately, about the practical challenge of directing a cast this large, and I like this quote because it's so unglamorous, so far from the usual director talking points about vision and theme. He described the brothers' method as needing to be, in his words, firm but gentle at the same time, and said you have to create an environment where there's structure, but there's a lot of movement in the structure. It's advice that could apply to raising several dozen unruly children about equally well as to directing several dozen movie stars, and I rather suspect the two jobs aren't as different as you'd think. He's also described the day-to-day logistics of scheduling actors on a production this size as, and I'm quoting this one directly because I don't think I could improve on it, a very complicated chess game, saying every day they're trying to figure out who's actually available to shoot. If you've ever tried to get 4 friends to agree on a dinner reservation, multiply that by roughly 30 working actors, most of whom have their own separate film and television commitments stacked up around the world, and you start to get a sense of what a production office, something like this, actually looks like behind the scenes. It's less a film shoot, some days, and more an air traffic control problem that occasionally also requires someone to remember their lines. That's the origin of the thing, more or less. Cancelled story about a time-travelling conqueror, a genuinely funny scrapped joke about a rookie Kang with an apology card taped to him, a director who left before the scandal that gets blamed for his leaving, and a replacement built, in the Russos' own words, from something close to scratch than a normal sequel would require. Whatever you think of the finished film, once it actually arrives, the road to it alone would make a decent hour of television on its own. Now, let's talk about the man in the mask, since I promised him his own proper stretch of time, and I intend to keep that promise. Robert Downey Jr. playing Dr. Doom is, on paper, one of the stranger casting decisions in the studio's history, and I say that as someone who likes it quite a lot. He is a man who spent 11 years as the face of this entire franchise, who died on screen in Avengers Endgame, snapping away half a universe's worth of villains at the cost of his own life, coming back not as a ghost, not as a variant of the same character, but as an entirely different person who happens to share his exact face. Marvel announced it the way they announce most enormous things now, with a stage reveal. The Russo brothers setting the moment up as a line of masked figures in green, hooded suits, built in the visual language of classic Doom armour, walked out together, until one of them stepped forward and pulled back the hood to reveal Downey himself. It's the kind of reveal designed to get a room to make a very specific noise, and by every account, it worked. The obvious question, the one I imagine occurred to you the second you heard the casting news, if you hadn't already read about it, is whether this is some kind of trick, whether Tony Stark is somehow still involved, whether this Doom is secretly a Stark variant from another universe who's simply taken up the mask and the name. It's not a silly theory, and it deserves a fair hearing before I tell you where it currently stands, because it's built out of real, existing pieces of this universe, rather than pure guesswork. Doctor Strange, in the Multiverse of Madness, introduced a concept called dream walking, where a variant from one universe can project their consciousness into, and effectively take control of, another universe's version of themselves. It's an established rule of how this multiverse works, not something a theorist invented. Junta isso, o factor de própria Downey separtilhado, dos sets de filmagens, uma foto com uma banda desenhada, de Doom puxado entre as suas coisas, de uma forma que parecia demasiado via para ser acidente. E percebes porque tanta gente brau a ideia de que isto era o Tony Stark a passear pela mente de Victor Von Doom, em vez de Victor Von Doom ser simplesmente el propio. Marvel has since, according to multiple outlets, pushed back on that theory directly, saying this is meant to be read as the genuine Victor Von Doom, not a Stark variant wearing his face. I should be straight with you about the strength of that denial though, because it matters for how much weight you should put on it. The reporting I trust here characterises studio comments, rather than quoting Marvel verbatim on the record. So I'd call this reportedly shot down, rather than an ironclad, quotable denial. My own reading, for what it's worth, and you're free to take this with whatever grain of salt feels right at this hour, is that the studio wouldn't have bothered addressing the theory at all if the honest answer were a dramatic yes. So I lean toward believing the denial, but I'll flag it every time it comes up tonight anyway, because that's the deal I made with you at the start. One detail Marvel has been genuinely disciplined about, and I mean that as a compliment, is Doom's face. As of everything currently public, every trailer, every special look reel shown at fan conventions, the marketing has not shown Downey's unmasked Doom face once. Voice and armour only. It's a deliberate choice, and it's also, whether the Russos intended the echo, consciously or not, a very old one. In the comics, Doom made his debut in Fantastic Four issue 5, all the way back in 1962, written by Stan Lee and drawn by Jack Kirby, and he was an instant hit with readers. But Lee and Kirby didn't actually explain how he became Doom. Full origin, the scarring, the sorcery, the Latverian throne, until 2 full years later, in a separate annual issue. Marvel sat on that backstory for 2 years on purpose, in an era when comics came out monthly, and fans had no internet to speculate on in the meantime. Whether the studio's current silence on his face is a conscious homage to that pacing, or simply smart marketing instinct converging on the same idea, I honestly don't know, and I don't think it matters much which it is. Either way, it's the same instinct, 60-odd years apart, and reporting on the production suggests Marvel intends to keep him fully masked through the entirety of this film, saving the unmasking, and presumably its fallout, for the sequel. There's a name behind the name too, which I find quietly charming. Stan Lee talked, later in his life, about wanting this new villain to feel, in his own words, soul-stirring, a super sensational new villain, and landing on the name Dr. Doom specifically, because he felt it was eloquent in its simplicity and magnificent in its implied menace. That's Lee's own phrase, and it's a very Lee thing to say, a little grandiose, a little proud of itself, and also just correct. Dr. Doom is a tremendous name for a villain. It tells you everything before he said a word. Kirby, meanwhile, gets the credit for what the name actually looks like. A medieval hood and cloak layered over armour, the blank iron mask, with no visible eyes, a design that reads simultaneously as a monarch, a monk, and a machine. Lee gave him the voice on the page. Kirby gave him the silhouette. Between the two of them, they built a villain so complete that a film 60-plus years later is still building its marketing strategy around the specific choices they made. If Doom's unmasked face ever does show up on screen, and going by the current plan, that's a Secret Wars problem rather than a Doomsday one, there's a specific piece of leaked concept material worth mentioning, gently, as exactly what it is, which is leaked and unconfirmed rather than official. Reporting suggests the design underneath the mask leans on classic Universal Monsters makeup as a reference point, specifically evoking the Phantom of the Opera, another disfigured genius hiding behind a mask, brilliant and bitter, and, in his own mind at least, entirely justified. If that's where the design actually lands, it's a lovely piece of casting against type for a superhero movie, reaching backward past comic book history into 1920s horror cinema for its texture. And then there's the jacket. This is one of those details that only exists because someone in the audience was paying far more attention than any reasonable person should be expected to. At the San Diego Comic-Con panel, where Downey was revealed, he wore a jacket printed with an invented alphabet, presumably meant to represent a Latverian script. A fan at the convention sat down afterward and actually decoded it, and it turns out the runes, which visually resemble Old Norse Elder Fathark lettering, kind of script you'd see on a runestone, are actually just a simple one-to-one substitution cipher standing in the ordinary English alphabet. It's not a deep constructed language, not something a linguist spent months building. It's a costume department's private joke, dressed up to look ancient. I like that it exists at all, honestly. This tiny, solvable puzzle, hidden in plain sight on a jacket, made for an audience that was always going to include at least one person determined enough to crack it before the panel had even finished. For what it's worth, the comics have long given Latveria its own invented linguistic texture too, describing the population as speaking a fictional dialect rooted in real Hungarian, alongside German, English and Romany, a small piece of geography and culture built up over decades that the film's costume department is, one way or another, drawing from. So that's Doom, or as much of him as we're currently allowed to see. A face we haven't been shown, a theory that's probably wrong, a name Stan Lee was visibly proud of, and a jacket with a puzzle stitched into it for the one person in the crowd who'd bother to solve it. I find something rather fitting in that, a villain built entirely, so far, out of withheld information, which is, if you think about it, exactly what a man who hides behind an iron mask would want. Now, if you're already drifting a little, that's completely fine. Honestly, that's rather the idea of putting this on in the first place. We're only just getting into the size of this thing, and there's no test waiting at the end of it. Nothing to remember, nothing that needs writing down. If you surface again, in a few minutes we'll still be here, which brings us to the sheer scale of who's actually in this film, because I think it's easy to read a headline that says the Avengers and the Fantastic Four and the X-Men are all in one movie and let that wash over you without really absorbing what it means logistically. Marvel's own synopsis language describes the film as following heroes from 3 distinct universes set on what they call a deadly collision course. And that phrase, 3 distinct universes, is doing a lot of quiet work. It means this isn't simply a big ensemble movie in the way the earlier Avengers films were big ensemble movies, where everyone at least shared the same continuity going in. This is closer to 3 separate franchises, each with their own decades of internal logic, being pushed into the same physical space at once. The strangest, and for a lot of long-time fans, most emotional piece of that puzzle is the return of the old Fox-era X-Men cast, the actors who defined these mutants on screen long before this shared universe existed. Patrick Stewart as Professor Xavier, Ian McKellen as Magneto, Alan Cumming back as Nightcrawler, Rebecca Roman as Mystique, James Marsden as Cyclops, Kelsey Grammer as Beast. Some of these actors hadn't played these roles in well over a decade. McKellen, specifically, hadn't put the actual Magneto helmet back on since X-Men The Last Stand, which came out back in 2006, since his older Magneto skipped the headgear entirely when he returned for Days of Future Past. And here's the thing worth sitting with for a second, because I think it's the detail people skip past fastest, the one that actually matters most if you're trying to work out what this movie is doing, rather than just enjoying that it's happening. Marvel has been careful, deliberately careful, not to confirm whether these are the literal same characters from the old Fox timeline walking back into continuity, or whether they're multiverse variants, new people who simply happen to share a face and a performer with characters we already know. The ambiguity isn't an oversight, it's the marketing strategy. Don't take it as settled fact, whichever way you'd personally prefer it to land. The Fox X-Men universe survived intact and is now simply part of the same story as Iron Man and Captain America. What we actually know is narrower than that, and more interesting for being narrower. Honestly, 2 franchises that were never, in any legal or narrative sense, the same universe are colliding on screen for the first time, and nobody involved has told us yet what that collision actually means for who these people are. There's a nice piece of continuity if you want a small, comics-literate reason to believe these characters can plausibly come back rather than being replaced wholesale by fresh variants. Deadpool and Wolverine, back in 2024, introduced a Tiva leader fans know as Hunter B-15, the same agent from the Loki series, and Deadpool convinces her to let the stranded Deadpool variants get back to their own home universes, rather than leaving them to rot away in the void forever. It's a small world-building detail, easy to miss if you were mostly there for the fight choreography, but it quietly establishes a rule that abandoned multiverse characters can, in principle, be retrieved and restored rather than simply discarded. That's not proof of anything about this specific cast, to be clear, but it's the kind of mechanism that makes their return feel like it fits inside the existing rules of this world, rather than requiring the studio to invent something new on the spot. Take Gambit specifically, since his presence in this cast is one of the odder little stories buried inside the bigger one. Trailer footage shows him fighting Shang-Chi, a genuinely strange pairing on paper, a Cajun card-throwing thief squaring off against a martial artist from a completely different corner of this franchise. What makes it worth pausing on is Gambit's own history in live action, which has been a bit of a graveyard for years. There was a Channing Tatum solo Gambit film in development for what felt like a decade, through multiple directors, multiple script rewrites that never actually got made, cancelled somewhere along the way after years of false starts. Watching him show up here in someone else's ensemble movie effectively resurrects a character whose own headlining vehicle simply never happened, which strikes me as a strange kind of second life for a character. Not the film he was promised, but a film nonetheless. I do want to mention, gently, that this particular fight cost Tatum something real. Reporting indicates he suffered an actual leg injury filming the Gambit sequence against Dr. Doom, serious enough to require a stunt double for the physical combat work, with Tatum himself covering close-ups and dialogue, and facing something in the region of 6 months of physical therapy afterward. It's easy to watch an action sequence like that and assume the star did all of it himself, because that's usually the implicit promise these films are selling you. It's worth remembering, every so often, that somewhere behind even a fairly small-looking hallway fight, there's a real person's knee. The veterans in this cast get treated a little differently, and I like the specific texture of what's been reported about that. Ian McKellen has talked about how he and Patrick Stewart, both of them in their 80s by now, were regarded on set as, in his words, old-timers, but that the production allowed them to have comfortable seats. It's such a small and glamorous detail, and I think that's exactly why I find it charming, rather than trivial. Behind the scale and the spectacle, there's still just a production office somewhere, worrying about whether two of the most respected actors of their generation have somewhere decent to sit between takes. Stewart, for his part, has pushed back directly on any suggestion that this film is some kind of farewell role for him, telling an interviewer that while there are, in his words, fewer and fewer available roles as he ages, he's still getting offers he finds interesting and still enjoys being challenged by new work. Read into that whatever you'd like. I read it as a man who isn't finished yet and would rather you didn't treat him like he is. Rebecca Romijn gave one of my favourite quotes in the entire research pass for tonight, and I'll pass it along close to word for word because paraphrasing would lose the texture of it. Describing a specific shooting day with something close to the full principal cast, roughly 35 actors, on set together at once. She called it very surreal and said she and the other actors kept turning to each other between takes, just saying, "This is crazy." She also mentioned having unusually vivid, what she called regressive dreams during the shoot, her own explanation being that her brain was somewhere in the background quietly processing what it meant to be playing Mystique again after roughly 20 years away from the character. I don't know what to do with a detail like that, except pass it along exactly as given, because I think it tells you something true about what it must actually feel like to step back into a version of yourself you left behind 2 decades ago on a soundstage surrounded by 34 other people having some version of the same experience simultaneously. And the reveal of all this cast wasn't a quiet press release. It was staged in March of 2025 as a live stream event that reportedly ran somewhere around 5.5 hours, unveiling dozens of actor chairs one by one, roughly every 10 minutes, across an entire evening. The numbers on that event are, frankly, a little absurd. Reporting puts it around 275 million digital views and over 3 million social interactions, which outlets described as roughly 5 times the social volume of the previous record holder for this kind of thing, which had been Deadpool and Wolverine's trailer drop. Reaction to the format itself was honestly split in real time, from what I've read. Plenty of people online mocked the slow, one chair at a time pacing as, in their words, ridiculous, dragged out for no good reason, while plenty of others treated the full 5.5-hour runtime as a fun, communal, almost sporting event to watch unfold together. I rather like that both of those reactions are true at once, and that Marvel, whatever else you think of the choice, clearly understood that either reaction keeps people talking for an entire evening, which was presumably the actual point all along. Now, let's go back to that mask, and the family standing near it, because I think the Fantastic Four side of this story deserves its own proper attention, rather than being folded into the general cast talk. The 4 of them carried over directly from their own film, The Fantastic Four First Steps, which came out in the summer of 2025. Pedro Pascal as Reed Richards, Mr. Fantastic, the stretching genius who thinks his way out of every problem. Vanessa Kirby as Sue Storm, Invisible Woman. Joseph Quinn as Johnny Storm, the Human Torch. Eben Moss Backrack as Ben Grimm, the Thing. All 4 reprising the roles they'd just spent an entire film establishing, which matters, because it means Doomsday isn't introducing this family to us cold. It's picking up people we, and the wider Marvel Cinematic Universe, already know. I mentioned the ending of that film briefly a little while ago, but it's worth actually walking through it properly now, since it's the direct hinge into everything we're discussing tonight. First Steps ends with Galactus, the planet-devouring, cosmic threat the family spends the whole film fighting, and the Silver Surfer is Herald, both flung deep into space, out into the far reaches of what the film establishes as Earth 828, the specific designated universe the Fantastic Four occupy. I want to be precise about the word I use there, because it matters. Flung, not defeated, not killed. Galactus is not dead. He and the Surfer are simply a very long way away, and reporting suggests they're the kind of threat that doesn't necessarily stay a long way away forever, which is its own quiet, unresolved thread, hanging somewhere off screen for a future film to pick back up, whenever that turns out to be. Then comes the mid-credits scene, the one I opened with tonight. And here's a detail that a surprising number of recap videos get slightly wrong, in a way that actually changes the emotional read of the scene if you don't know it. The mid-credits sequence doesn't happen right after the main events of the film. It jumps forward exactly 4 years. Sue Storm is reading to Franklin, her son, now a young boy of about 4 or 5 rather than a newborn, inside the Baxter Building, when the cloaked figure appears holding out that silver mask. 4 years is a meaningfully long gap for a mid-credits scene to cover. It means whatever Doom's relationship to this family turns out to be, it isn't springing directly out of the immediate aftermath of the Galactus crisis. There's a gap in there, an unexplored stretch of time where the world kept turning and the Richards family kept living their lives before Doom finally, deliberately, chose that particular moment to arrive. I find that gap more unsettling than an immediate follow-up would have been, honestly. It suggests patience on Doom's part, or at least planning, rather than a villain simply next in line to show up. And the reason it's specifically this family Doom walks in on, rather than, say, Tony Stark's old workshop or Steve Rogers' front porch, isn't an arbitrary storytelling choice. And this is where I think it's worth zooming out into the comics for a second, because the film is actually being quite faithful to something very old here. In the source material, going back decades, Doom's classic, defining rivalry has never really been with Iron Man. It's with Reed Richards specifically. Most tellings place the two of them as rivals going back to their college years, brilliant, arrogant young men who took very different paths after some falling out or accident, depending on which version of the origin you're reading, one becoming a celebrated hero, the other retreating into Latveria in a suit of armour. It's a rivalry built on old wounds and older pride, closer in shape to a bitter former friendship than a simple hero versus villain setup. So when the marketing for this film chose to have Doom's very first act, his literal entrance into this universe, be walking into the Baxter Building and finding the Richards family specifically, that's not the film inventing a new relationship out of thin air to justify pairing two popular actors together. That's the film reaching all the way back to Fantastic Four issue 5, back to 1962, and picking up the character's single oldest, most load-bearing grudge, and letting it be the engine that pulls him into the rest of the story. I think that's a really elegant piece of structuring. If the finished film actually follows through on it, the way the marketing implies, it would mean the biggest crossover event this studio has ever attempted is, underneath all the multiversal noise and the collapsing timelines, actually kicked off by something almost embarrassingly personal. Not a plan to conquer the multiverse from the outset. A man walking back into the life of someone he's resented since university, holding out a mask like a calling card. There's a small, quiet postscript worth mentioning here too, since we're on the subject of the Fantastic Four's corner of this story, and I don't want to lose it among everything else. First Steps also included a separate, entirely unrelated post-credits scene, a comedic, in-universe cartoon intro for the Fantastic Four, not connected to the Doom plot at all. More of a stylistic flourish than a story beat. I mention it mostly so that if you ever go back and rewatch that film, you know not to sit there waiting for it to connect to anything we've talked about tonight. It doesn't. Sometimes a post-credits scene really is just a joke, and I think there's something almost restful about that. A franchise this enormous, still finding room for a bit that goes nowhere. So let's move to what's actually been shown in motion in the trailers themselves, since we've spent a fair bit of time now on how the pieces got assembled and not much yet on what they actually do once assembled. The centerpiece action beat that every trailer breakdown has fixated on is a confrontation between Thor and Doom. Footage shows Doom stopping Thor's axe, Stormbreaker, one-handed, without visible effort. That image feels familiar even if you've never seen the trailer described to you before. That's because it's deliberately staged to echo an earlier, much more painful moment in this franchise. Thor's badly outmatched fight against Thanos in Avengers Infinity War, the one that ends with a weapon buried in the wrong place and an entire timeline's worth of consequences following from it. Restaging that specific type of image, physically overwhelming villain casually absorbing a strike from one of the strongest Avengers, is the kind of visual shorthand that doesn't need a line of dialogue to land. It's Marvel telling you, quite plainly, how seriously they want you to take this new villain's power level by putting him in the exact posture of the last villain who nearly ended everything. There's a wider set piece too, shown across multiple trailers, of the Avengers fighting the X-Men directly, staged at the X-Mansion, which is actually a strange sentence to say out loud. He told the version of me watching the original Avengers back in 2012 that this was coming. Two teams that have never shared a frame in live action before this, thrown into direct combat with each other rather than side by side against a shared enemy. We've already talked about Gambit's piece of that fight, and I won't retread it, but that wider sequence exists as confirmed trailer material rather than leaked territory, which is more than I can say for a good chunk of what we'll get to later tonight. One small vocal detail that outlets specifically singled out, and I think rightly so, is Doom's accent. From his very first line in the first trailer, Downey plays him with a distinct Latvian accent, a deliberate, audible choice to separate the performance from Tony Stark immediately, before the audience has time to sit there, measuring the two performances against each other. Several pieces of trailer reaction coverage describe this as the specific moment that won over sceptical fans who'd gone in assuming they'd just be watching Downey play Tony Stark in a slightly different suit. It's a small thing, an accent, but it's doing a lot of the same work the withheld unmasked face is doing elsewhere in the marketing. Both choices exist to keep a healthy, deliberate distance between the actor's most famous role and this new one. There's a costume detail worth mentioning too. If you have any fondness for old comics, the way I apparently do, because it's one of the more specific pieces of homage buried in this whole production. Namor's redesigned look in the trailer footage, a black bodysuit with blue accent scales, has been read by some long-time comic readers as a callback to an old Submariner comic in which the character wears an in-universe moisture suit, a device explained at the time as letting an amphibious character survive extended stretches on dry land without drying out. It's a 50-plus-year-old design choice, obscure enough that most casual viewers will simply read it as a cool new suit, translated fairly faithfully into a modern costume. I like these details precisely because they change nothing about how the scene plays for someone who's never opened one of these comics, and everything about how it plays for someone who has. Both audiences get a good costume. Only one of them gets the joke underneath it. Trailer decoders, the particular patient breed of person who pauses footage frame by frame, looking for things the rest of us would blink through, spotted something else worth mentioning. Inside a wide shot of a renovated Avengers tower. In the background of that shot sits an image of 3 connected globes. Comics literate viewers read this as a direct visual reference to Jonathan Hickman's own incursion storylines, specific comic panel imagery depicting Earth 616, the main Marvel universe, Earth 828, the Fantastic Four's universe as established on screen in First Steps, and the X-Men's universe, all shown converging toward collision. It's the kind of Easter egg that exists purely for people who've read the source material, buried in a single background prop, in a single wide shot, and I find something almost touching about a production this enormous still bothering to sneak something in that specific for an audience that small. And then there's a theory I want to flag clearly as unconfirmed fan analysis rather than anything approaching official material, because it's built entirely out of inference from set photography rather than any studio statement. Some analysts, looking at leaked costume and set photos, believe they've spotted 2 visually distinct Doom-style helmets and armour designs across different images, which has fed a theory that Downey's version might be some kind of decoy, with a second, unrevealed actor playing the true Doom later in the story. I'll be straightforward with you about where I land on this one. I think it's a fun theory, the kind of thing that's enjoyable to turn over for a few minutes before you fall asleep, and I think it's very likely nothing more than ordinary costume variation across different scenes, the kind of thing that happens on any production this size, misread by people, myself included on a slow enough night, who are primed to see conspiracy in every blurry photograph. But I wanted to give it to you honestly, as exactly what it is, a theory born from set photos, not from anything Marvel has said. Here's a detail that's easy to miss if you weren't already paying close attention to how the multiverse has been reorganised behind the scenes over the last few years, without much fanfare, and I think it's worth explaining properly once, because a lot of the bigger theories tonight lean on it without saying so out loud. For a long stretch of this franchise's history, there was an organisation called the Time Variance Authority, the TVA, whose entire job was pruning away branching timelines to keep everything funneled into one single sanctioned reality, on the orders of a figure called He Who Remains. That system is gone now. Sylvie, a variant of Loki, killed He Who Remains at the end of the first season of Loki, and by the end of the second season, Loki himself discovers that without a new anchor holding the timelines together, all of reality's branches are on the verge of collapsing entirely. So he does something rather extraordinary. He walks into the centre of it, into the temporal loom itself, and rather than destroy the branches to save one timeline, he chooses to hold all of them together himself, becoming, in the show's own language, the one who remains, and shaping every surviving branch into something called Yggdrasil, the world tree, a structure that lets the multiverse exist and grow freely rather than being pruned back down to a single sanctioned line. That's why an open, sprawling, truly dangerous multiverse currently exists at all for a film like Doomsday to even be possible. There's no T-VAR left to prune away the universes that are now colliding. Loki himself, under the radar, alone, is the only thing currently holding all of them up. Which brings us to Steve Rogers. And honestly, of everything in this whole enormous pile of trailers and leaks and casting news, this is the thread that I find myself turning over the most at this hour. Chris Evans is confirmed returning as Steve Rogers, shown in trailer footage lifting, or at minimum stopping Mjolnir, which for anyone who remembers the emotional gut punch of that gag, paying off seriously in Endgame, tells you plainly that whoever this version of Steve is, he's still worthy. But here's the detail I keep coming back to, because I think it's the single most deliberate costume choice in the entire marketing campaign. This Steve Rogers has long hair and a full beard, and that specific look isn't new. It's the exact look he wore in Avengers Infinity War, years before Endgame's own ending, before the version of Steve we last saw hand off his shield to Sam Wilson as an old man on a lake house porch, having lived out a full, quiet life in the past after returning the Infinity Stones. That elderly porch scene is Steve's canonical, on-screen ending. It happened. Nobody is contradicting it. But the Steve shown in Doomsday trailers, very deliberately, is not wearing that ending. He's wearing an earlier one, a younger one, a bearded one, and multiple outlets covering the trailer breakdowns have landed on the same reading I have, which is that this specific costume choice is Marvel all but confirming, without saying it outright, that whatever we're looking at isn't simply a continuation of the old man from the porch. It's something stranger, a variant, a different branch, a different point in a life that, thanks to the multiverse rules we just walked through, no longer has to be singular the way it once did. There's a piece of trailer footage that outlets have connected directly to this, and I think it's a lovely, quiet bit of continuity, if the reading holds. Loki appears briefly in his TVA uniform near a house that closely resembles Steve's post-Endgame home, the one from that porch scene. The prevailing interpretation, and I want to flag this clearly as interpretation rather than a confirmed plot point, since Marvel hasn't spelled out the mechanics on screen yet, is that Loki, now empowered as the figure holding the whole multiverse together, personally intervened to protect this particular branch of Steve's life from being erased or collapsed back before the TV as old pruning system was dismantled for good. That's right, it means a scene from Loki's second season finale, something most casual viewers watched 2 years ago and have long since filed away, is the quiet, direct, mechanical cause of Steve Rogers existing to be in this film at all. That's the kind of long-delayed payoff I find, for what it is worth, satisfying. Less because of any twist, and more because it means someone in a writer's room is keeping very careful track of a small gesture from a very different show and decided it deserved to matter. And there's a second confirmed piece to this puzzle that makes the whole thing feel less accidental and more like a deliberate thread being pulled. Hayley Atwell is confirmed returning as Peggy Carter, and by most accounts she appeared on stage at D23 in 2026, alongside both Downey and Evans. The pairing of Evans' Steve with Atwell's Peggy, shown together at that specific reveal, has led multiple outlets to connect it directly to these same theories about which version of Steve's life, which branch, which timeline we're actually watching unfold. I won't pretend to know the answer. Nobody outside the production currently does. But I like that the marketing has given us just enough matching pieces. The beard, the house, the TV uniform, Peggy standing next to him at a convention panel to make the puzzle feel solvable, even though it isn't solved yet. One small, purely fun aside from that same D23 panel, since we could all use a lighter beat in the middle of a long night. Hugh Jackman appeared in person, and Ryan Reynolds sent in a video message, specifically to jokingly beg for a spot in the cast. Neither of them is a confirmed part of this film. It's just a bit. A real, documented moment from the panel itself. Two actors performing a very public, very affectionate campaign to be included in something they apparently aren't in. I mention it mostly because I think it says Something rather sweet about where this whole corner of the industry has ended up, that even actors this famous are willing to stand up and essentially ask nicely on camera. Now here's a piece of trivia that in fact rearranged how I think about a film I'd already seen in theatres, and I suspect it might do the same for you, so bear with me while I set it up properly. Thunderbolts, the ensemble film about Marvel's team of morally grey former assets and anti-heroes, came out in 2025, and like most of these films, it ended with a post-credits scene. If you saw it, you'll probably remember the broad shape of that scene, even if the details have faded by now. That team, freshly reorganised, stepping into a new role in the wider world. What I did not know until putting this brief together, and what I suspect most people watching it in a theatre in 2025 had no way of knowing either, is that the Russo brothers themselves have since confirmed they directed that scene, and that it was shot as part of Avengers Doomsday's own production, not by Jake Schreier, the director actually credited with Thunderbolts as a whole. So a scene that millions of people watched, filed away as simply a nice stinger tying off someone else's film, was, by the filmmaker's own account, literal footage from this movie, repurposed to serve as a lead in over a year before Doomsday itself was even close to release. I find that plainly strange to think about. Somewhere out there, a very large number of people have already, technically, seen a piece of tonight's subject and didn't know it at the time, and in some cases, still don't. That connects to a thread of merchandise leaks that I think tells us more concretely than almost anything else tonight about where this film's story actually starts. A leaked Lego set, the kind of thing collectors and set trackers pick up on well before any official announcement, shows a grouping of figures: Sentry, Red Guardian, Bucky Barnes, and Yelena Belova, essentially the surviving core of that Thunderbolts team, positioned together at a set piece labelled as a new Avengers Tower alongside a Doctor Doom figure. On its own, a Lego set leak is a fairly thin thread to hang a theory on, I'll grant you that. But there's a specific detail that makes it feel sturdier than the usual toy aisle speculation, which is that Bucky's costume in that Doomsday theme set is identical, piece for piece as far as anyone's been able to tell, to the costume he was wearing in that very same Thunderbolts post-credits scene we just talked about. That's not two separate pieces of speculative merchandise, coincidentally landing on a similar idea. That's the same costume, carried directly across from one confirmed piece of footage into a leaked toy for the next film, which strongly suggests, even without a formal studio confirmation, that this team steps directly out of Thunderbolts and into Doomsday's opening state of the world, quite possibly under a new name, New Avengers, if the tower labelling on that Lego set is accurate. There's a further piece of plot rumour circulating around this same thread, and I want to flag it a shade more cautiously than the Lego detail, since it comes from broader plot rumour coverage, rather than physical merchandise you could theoretically hold in your hands and photograph. Reporting suggests Lewis Pullman's character, Sentry, one of the more physically overwhelming figures introduced in Thunderbolts, has to stop an incursion at some point in the film with his bare hands. If you're not familiar with what an incursion actually is in this universe's own internal logic, it's essentially the collision event between two universes touching each other, catastrophic on a scale that's surprisingly difficult to picture, let alone physically intervene in. The image of a single person holding that apart through sheer physical force, rather than through some clever piece of technology or magic, is a striking one, and if it holds up in the finished film, it would mark a fairly dramatic escalation for a character who, in his own introductory film, barely a year earlier, was still being treated as something of an unstable, half-trusted wildcard, rather than a load-bearing pillar of the entire plot. If you're getting drowsy around here, that's completely fine. This is a good place to let go for a while. We're deep into the trivia stretch of the evening now, and none of what's still ahead depends on you having caught every name in this one. Loki, Sentry, a Lego set, a scene you already saw without knowing it, it'll all still be here. I do want to say, before we move on, that I find something satisfying, in an unshowy sort of way, about a storytelling choice like this one, hiding a piece of your next film's opening state inside another film's stinger entirely. It rewards close attention without punishing anyone who wasn't paying it, since nothing about Thunderbolts itself required you to know any of this to enjoy it in the moment. The information was just sitting there the whole time, waiting for a Lego set and a director's own interview, comments to eventually connect the dots for the rest of us. Right, I think it's time to talk about the leak, the big one, the plot synopsis that's been circulating for a while now, and that I've been deliberately holding off on until I could set it up properly, because I want to be extremely clear about its status before I tell you a single detail of what it claims. This is not confirmed. I want to say that plainly. Once, before we go any further, a detailed plot synopsis has been circulating that claims to lay out the film's opening, an early confrontation involving Tobey Maguire's version of Spider-Man against Deadpool and Wolverine, a subplot involving Steve Rogers living out a quiet life with Peggy Carter and a son, and an ending in which Doom successfully rebuilds a version of Battleworld and wipes the memories of the people living on. It's so he can rule over them as a benevolent-seeming emperor who nobody remembers choosing not to elect. A commentator and industry figure named John Campea has said publicly that the leak aligns with things he's independently heard from his own sources, which lends it a little more weight than an anonymous forum post would carry on its own. But the broader reporting I've read on this leak is notably careful, describing what it calls significant gaps in the account, gaps that raise doubts about whether the whole thing is genuine rather than a plausible sounding fabrication assembled from educated guesses. Coverage of it is, honestly, split right down the middle, with some outlets treating it as a serious, credible leak worth taking at face value, and others explicitly asking, in their own headlines, whether it's really real. I don't know the answer, and I'd be lying to you at this hour if I pretended I did. To take everything in this specific stretch as exactly that, a leak that's been circulating, not something Marvel has confirmed, ranked somewhere between plausible and completely made up, and probably closer to the middle of that range than either end. What I can offer you, if the memory-wiping Emperor piece of that leak turns out to hold any water at all, is a genuine comic book precedent for it, one that predates even Secret Wars, which we'll get to properly in a little while. Back in 1987, a graphic novel called Emperor Doom depicted Victor Von Doom conquering and mentally enslaving the entire world, not through Battleworld or cosmic power theft, but by harnessing the mind control abilities of a villain called Purple Man. It's a different mechanism than the Secret Wars version of Doom, as godlike ruler, an earlier, smaller scale, more directly sinister take on the same basic fantasy. A genius who simply decides the world would run better if everyone in it simply stopped being able to disagree with him. If the leak synopsis is accurate even in broad strokes, it's drawing, whether deliberately or by convergent evolution, on a properly old piece of the character's history, rather than inventing the idea of mind-controlled subjects out of nothing. While we're on the subject of things that are unconfirmed but persistent, I should mention, briefly and with about as much weight as it deserves, the recurring rumour that Taylor Swift might appear in this film as Dazzler, a mutant character with sound to light powers. This rumour has been circulating in one form or another since 2023, and its origin is actually a fairly mundane, documented event, rather than any kind of leak. Swift was photographed at a football game, sitting with Sean Levy, the director of Deadpool and Wolverine, alongside that film's stars Ryan Reynolds and Hugh Jackman. She didn't appear in that film at all, not even a cameo, but the photograph alone was enough to convince a certain corner of the internet that Marvel was courting her for something, and the rumour simply migrated, undiminished by zero actual evidence, all the way over to Doomsday casting speculation, where it's persisted with, again, no official confirmation at any point along the way. I like this one less as a plot theory and more as a small case study in how a rumour can survive purely on vibes. A single photograph doing more narrative work in the public imagination than any actual casting announcement ever did. And now, the one everyone's actually been waiting for me to get to, and the one where I have the least certainty to offer you of anything tonight. Elizabeth Olsen and the status of Wanda Maximoff, Scarlet Witch. Here's what we actually know, plainly, without hedging. Per Marvel's own official, in-universe timeline material, Wanda's canonical status is dead, having seemingly destroyed herself, along with the Darkhold and Mount Wundagore, at the end of that second Doctor Strange film, back in 2022. That's the settled record, as it currently stands. Everything past that sentence gets really murky. Olsen herself has given contradictory statements at different points, at times saying she won't be appearing in Doomsday or Secret Wars at all, citing a scheduling conflict with another project she'll be filming during principal photography, while at other times discussing, separately, ideas she's personally pitched to Marvel for, where she'd like to see the character go next, which isn't the kind of thing you typically hear from someone who considers the story finished. There are also insider reports, including from a leaker named Alex Perez, suggesting some kind of stunt double or body double workaround, filming a masked or obscured version of the character around Olsen's own scheduling limitations. I'll level with you that I found no official confirmation either way in any of the research for tonight. Not a denial, not a confirmation, just genuine, ongoing ambiguity, sitting right at the centre of one of this franchise's most beloved characters. I don't think that's a satisfying note to leave a theory on, and I'm sorry I can't tidy it up for you before you drift off. Some things, even in a story built this carefully, just aren't decided yet, not even by the people making it. Anyway, let's go somewhere calmer for a while, back into the comics themselves, since I think understanding what the films are actually adapting helps make sense of everything we've talked about so far. And there's actually a lovely piece of misdirection sitting right at the centre of the source material that I don't think gets discussed enough. The word incursion, which we defined a little earlier tonight, comes from a 2015 comic book event called Secret Wars, written by Jonathan Hickman, widely regarded as one of the more structurally ambitious stories Marvel has ever published. And here's the detail I most want to leave you with in this whole stretch, because I think it undercuts, rather unassumingly, an assumption a lot of casual viewers are probably carrying into this film without realising it. In the comics, the incursions, the slow-motion collisions between parallel universes that eventually destroy everything, aren't actually caused by Doctor Doom. The root cause is a cosmic threat called the Beyonders, entities operating on a scale so far above ordinary heroes and villains that they're barely characters in the traditional sense, more like a force of narrative weather. Doom doesn't create the crisis. He notices it happening, recognises an opportunity in the chaos, and with help from Doctor Strange and a reformed villain called the Molecule Man, essentially steals the Beyonder's power for himself once the dust has settled, remaking what's left of every collapsed universe into a single patchwork world called Battleworld, and crowning himself God Emperor of the whole thing. I find that structure truly more interesting than a straightforward villain causing a crisis and then having to be stopped. Doom, in the comics at least, is closer to the smartest opportunist in the room than he is the architect of the disaster itself. If the films end up following that same shape, even loosely, it would mean the actual villain of this two-part story isn't necessarily the man we've spent this whole video getting to know. It might be something else entirely, something cosmic and mostly faceless, with Doom simply being the one clever and ruthless enough to end up standing on top of the wreckage once it's over. I should stress, since none of this has been confirmed as the film's actual plot structure, that it's exactly what it is, a theory seeded directly by the comics rather than by any marketing material, but it's a theory I find myself drawn back to more than most of the others tonight, mostly because it's sourced to something concrete rather than assembled from trailer frames and set photos. There's a specific comics only detail from that same Secret Wars event that I think would make for a wonderful, if currently entirely unconfirmed, visual if the films ever wanted to use it. On Battleworld, Doom's rule is enforced in part by something called the Thor Corps, a small army made up of alternate universe variants of Thor, all loyal to him, all patrolling his patchwork empire, as a kind of police force built from the strongest hero the source material has to offer, turned against itself across dozens of realities. It's a strange, striking image on the page, dozens of hammer-wielding enforcers, all wearing slightly different faces, and it's not something Marvel Studios has hinted at for the films in any way I could find. I mention it purely because it's the kind of thing that, if it ever showed up on screen, would be an enormous, faithful swing at one of the stranger corners of this story. And I'd rather plant the idea in your head now, clearly labelled as comics only, and let you stumble across it in a future trailer, with no context at all. Kevin Feige himself has specifically named a different, related piece of comics history as an influence, worth distinguishing carefully from the Secret Wars material we just walked through. It's a separate storyline called Time Runs Out, which ran through Hickman's own Avengers and New Avengers books, leading directly into the Secret Wars event, rather than being the event itself. That storyline depicts a fracture within the hero community itself. Iron Man and Mr. Fantastic's Illuminati, a secret council of the smartest, most powerful heroes, making unilateral decisions to try to survive the incursions, clashing directly with Captain America's more openly organised Avengers, and with Namor's own faction, called the Cabal, over fundamentally different philosophies for how to handle a crisis this large. Some want to make brutal, secret sacrifices to buy time. Others want everyone told the truth, whatever the cost. If Doomsday follows that shape even partially, it gives us a precise, named comic source for the idea of heroes turning on each other over how to handle an incursion crisis, rather than simply uniting cleanly against an outside threat, the way the earlier Avengers films tended to. One last small piece of trivia before we move into the last proper stretch of tonight, and I include it mostly because I find it a rather sweet, slightly odd, footnote to everything we discussed earlier about Kang's cancelled storyline. The character hasn't actually vanished from Marvel's output entirely, just from this specific live-action corner of it. John Delancey, probably best known to a lot of you as Q from Star Trek The Next Generation, is reported to now voice Kang in the animated series X-Men 97 in its second season, on a completely separate voice cast track in the abandoned Jonathan Majors live-action version. It's a strange little reminder that a franchise this large doesn't really retire an idea so much as relocate it. Kang didn't disappear from Marvel. He just moved to a different building with a different actor and kept going without the corner of the audience watching Doomsday tonight necessarily noticing at all. Right, let's spend some proper time on the actual shoot itself, because I think the production history of this film is honestly stranger and more interesting than most of the theories we've covered, and it's the kind of material that tends to get skipped past in favour of flashier trailer talk. Take the secrecy operation first, since it's the piece of this whole story that impressed me most while I was putting the research together. A production this size, this many stars, this many practical locations, is normally a leak hunter's dream. Someone with a phone camera and a decent zoom lens usually manages to get something out. A costume, a set piece, a blurry combat rehearsal, somewhere over the course of months of filming. Marvel and the Russos went to, for what it is worth, unusual lengths to prevent that here. A whole production shot under a deliberately boring cover name, Apple Pie 1, printed on call sheets and location permits specifically, so anyone stumbling across the paperwork wouldn't think twice about it. Filming happened primarily on sound stages at Pinewood Studios in Buckinghamshire, with location work chosen by multiple accounts, specifically for how secluded it was, rather than for any purely aesthetic reason, and by several outlets reporting it worked about as well as a secrecy operation like this can reasonably work. The film wrapped without a single plot revealing set leak, making it into public circulation. which multiple outlets specifically flagged as a genuine rarity for a production of this scale, this many UK locations, and this many recognisable faces walking around a set every day for months. One location choice in particular stands out to me, mostly because of what it apparently cost. Marvel reportedly paid a very large sum, not disclosed publicly in exact figures, as far as I could find, to film at Windsor Great Park, on grounds connected to Windsor Castle, actual royal property. Set photographers, who did catch glimpses from public vantage points, noted a full practical house build constructed on the grounds specifically for the shoot. It's one of the largest, most expensive practical location gets in recent memory for this franchise. The kind of decision that only makes financial sense if the studio is entirely confident the finished sequence justifies it. And I suppose we'll all find out together in December whether that confidence was well placed. There's a small piece of visual continuity worth circling back to here, since we spent a good chunk of time earlier tonight on those returning mutant actors rejoining this story. And Deadpool and Wolverine back in 2024 was already, almost by accident, setting the mood for that reunion before Doomsday's own marketing had even started. That film's void sequences, the dumping ground for abandoned and forgotten multiverse variants, were staged with a literal crumbling, decaying 20th Century Fox logo visible in the background. On-screen commentary, whether intentional or simply a fun visual bit, on the real-world fact that Disney's acquisition of Fox back in 2019 effectively ended the old Fox Marvel universe as an active, ongoing concern. Watching that same abandoned universe's actors walk back onto a soundstage for Doomsday a year or so later gives that crumbling logo a slightly different weight in hindsight. Not quite a ghost story anymore, more like a reunion nobody was entirely sure would happen. I want to mention something about the testing process too, since it offers a rare, if imperfect, glimpse behind the curtain at how this film has actually been landing with real audiences, as opposed to how it's landing in trailer comment sections. Reported test screenings, held before a later round of reshoots, we'll get to in a second, apparently drew direct comparisons to Avengers Infinity War, with some attendees reportedly calling it the Russos' best Marvel film yet, and rival studio executives, the kind of people who watch competitors' test screenings for professional rather than fan-related reasons, privately predicting it could end up as the highest grossing film of its release year. I temper how much weight anyone puts on any of that, because test screening reactions are famously unreliable predictors of final quality, and because outlets themselves were careful to note that the specific cut being screened predates a distinct, later round of what's being called character-first reshoots, to take the enthusiasm as an encouraging early signal, not a verdict. Since the version those attendees saw isn't quite the version that's going to end up in theatres, that second round of reshoots is worth explaining a little, since it's been misread in a few corners of the internet, in a way I think is worth gently correcting. Reporting describes a distinct round of reshoots, ordered for spring 2026, specifically aimed at strengthening character relationships and emotional payoffs across what is, by any measure, an enormous ensemble cast, rather than reworking the film's large-scale action sequences. Some fan speculation ran with the idea that this meant the ending, quote-unquote, wasn't working, and needed to be fixed. The reporting I trust here pushes back on that fairly explicitly, describing that particular concern as overstated. My own reading, for what it's worth, is that character first reshoots on a film with this many major names are less a sign of something broken, and more an entirely predictable consequence of trying to give 30-plus separate characters a genuine emotional beat inside a single runtime. That's an editing and pacing problem, not a crisis. And it's the kind of thing nearly every large ensemble film ends up doing some version of without making a fuss in the months before release. Take the music for a moment, since it's the kind of detail that's easy to overlook entirely. until you're actually sitting in the theatre and something in your chest recognises a melody before your brain has caught up. Alan Silvestri is confirmed returning as composer, officially announced back in July of 2024 for both this film and its sequel. This is the same composer behind Captain America, The First Avenger, the first Avengers film, Infinity War, and Endgame, which means the musical through line connecting this new film back to the beginning of the Infinity Saga isn't just a vague thematic echo I'm choosing to hear because I want it to be there. It's a literal, credited continuity choice. The same person, same instincts, coming back specifically to score this exact story. If there's a needle drop of the old Avengers theme anywhere in this film, and given the history here, I'd be a little surprised if there isn't one somewhere. It will be arriving from the same hands that wrote it the first time around. Not an impersonation of the sound, but the genuine source of it. The camera work tells a slightly more uncertain story, and it's one worth flagging honestly, rather than assuming everything about this production is operating at endgame level scale in every department. The film is shot by cinematographer Newton Thomas Sigel, working on a multi-camera digital pipeline built around Alexa 35 and Alexa ELPH-class cameras, rather than the dedicated large-format IMAX camera rigs that Infinity War was shot on almost entirely, a choice Marvel marketed heavily at the time under the banner of the whole film being shot natively for IMAX screens. Multiple outlets have reported genuine uncertainty over whether Doomsday will get a true native IMAX release across all markets, the way Infinity War did, which, if it holds, would be a subtle but real step back from that earlier marketing push. It doesn't necessarily mean anything about the finished film's quality. Digital cinema cameras have come a very long way, but it's a specific, technical distinction worth knowing if you were expecting an identical presentation format to Infinity War, simply because the directors are the same. Where the scale absolutely does show up, unambiguously, is in the visual effects numbers, and I have to say, reading through the individual vendor figures for this brief was a plainly sobering reminder of how many people's actual jobs go into 2.5 hours of footage most audiences will experience once and move on from. Framestore alone reportedly delivered several hundred effects shots. Base FX reportedly delivered a similarly large number of shots, and those are just 2 names on a much longer list that reportedly includes at least 7 other major houses working simultaneously across the production, among them Industrial Light and Magic, Waiter FX, Digital Domain, Sony Pictures Imageworks, Trickster, Rising Sun Pictures, and Rodeo FX. That's not a small boutique effects team handling a few hero shots. That's something closer to an entire distributed industry, spread across multiple countries and time zones, all working in parallel on pieces of the same 2.5-hour object, most of which none of us will ever be able to point to individually and say, that shot, that's the one Base FX did, that one's Framestore's. It'll all just be the movie, seamlessly, to anyone watching it in a dark theatre in December, which I suppose is rather the entire point of the job being done well. On the subject of length, since we touched on the runtime rumours briefly earlier tonight, I want to give you the actual reported number and its context, rather than just the vague sense that it's going to be very long. One outlet has reported a target runtime in the region of 2 hours and 45 minutes, which, if accurate, would place it as the second longest film in this franchise's history, behind only Endgame, which ran around 3 hours and 1 minute, and ahead of Infinity War, which ran roughly 2 hours and 29 minutes. Co-director Anthony Russo asked directly at a convention panel whether the film might run over 3 hours, didn't deny it outright. He reportedly offered something like this, and I rather like the phrasing for how carefully non-committal it manages to be. Hopefully, we will make you happy. That's not a number, that's a dodge, dressed up as a promise. And I mean that as a genuine compliment to whoever coached him on how to answer that question without answering it. I want to flag clearly that no confirmed final runtime exists as of this research. and that other, less careful reporting has speculated as long as 3 hours and 45 minutes, including credits, a figure I'd treat with real skepticism until an actual studio-confirmed running time shows up closer to release. But even the conservative end of that range tells you something. Marvel is positioning this film, through runtime alone, before a single review has been published, as belonging in the same conversation as Endgame, rather than as a normal, mid-sized sequel. And that's a deliberate signal, not an accident of how the edit happened to come together. I want to close this stretch on a piece of trivia that I think surprisingly earns the word historic, even though I try to avoid reaching for words like that whenever I can help it. According to the Marvel Cinematic Universe's own wiki and trivia pages, Avengers Doomsday is the first live-action film ever to unite the Avengers, the Fantastic Four, and the X-Men together on screen. 3 separate franchises with, in the case of the X-Men specifically, entirely separate decades of cinematic history, predating this shared universe altogether. And separately, the same trivia notes that this marks the first time Robert Downey Jr. has properly returned to this franchise since Endgame, a good many years on from when Iron Man launched the whole thing back in 2008, now playing a character who shares nothing with Tony Stark, except the actor's own face, and, I suspect, a fairly similar level of confidence in his own intelligence. 16 years is a strange span of time, honestly, to try to picture all at once. It's long enough for a child born the year Iron Man came out to have grown into an adult who might, tonight, be one of the people falling asleep to this very video. So, where does all of this actually leave us? Since we're getting toward the later hours now, and I'd like to spend a little time zooming back out before we close things down for the night. Everything we've talked about tonight, the mask, the beard, the Lego set, the accent, the leaked synopsis nobody can quite agree is real, all of it is building toward a story that, by design, doesn't finish here. Avengers Doomsday is explicitly the first half of a 2-part structure, with Avengers Secret Wars set to follow roughly a year later, at the tail end of 2027, after both films were pushed back together, without much fanfare, from their original May release dates, to give the effects heavy production the extra time it apparently needed. That means almost everything unresolved in tonight's video. Wanda's true status, whether this Steve Rogers is the same one who sat on that porch, whether the Fox X-Men actually share continuity with the mainline universe, or are simply borrowing its space for a while, is being deliberately left unresolved on purpose, not because nobody's decided yet, but because the story itself is structured as one long question that doesn't get its answer until the second film. I find that a slightly unusual way to build a blockbuster, honestly. Asking an audience to carry that much open-ended uncertainty across an entire calendar year, but it's also, if you think about it, not so different from what a lot of these theory-heavy franchises have always under the radar asked of their most dedicated viewers. Wait, watch closely, trust that the pieces you're being handed now will matter later. What I keep coming back to, turning all of this over one more time before we let it go for the night, is how much of tonight's story is actually about repair rather than destruction. You squint at it the right way. A cancelled villain replaced by an older, stranger one whose whole comic book history is built on a grudge rather than a grand scheme. A cast of X-Men actors stepping back into roles some of them left behind 20 years ago, with Rebecca Romijn reportedly describing the experience as something close to a regressive dream. A character's own scrapped storyline turning up years later in an entirely different animated show, voiced by an actor who spent decades playing an entity that manipulated time for fun. A stinger scene millions of people already watched without knowing what it actually was. Nothing in this whole enormous production seems to disappear cleanly. Just relocates, gets folded back in somewhere else, waits for the right film to pick it back up. Maybe that's just how a franchise this old and this tangled has to work by now, since there's simply too much history built up to ever fully let go of any of it. Or maybe that's me reading a theme into a 2.5-hour blockbuster that's mostly just trying to get 35 actors through a coherent plot without anyone tripping over each other's storylines. I go back and forth on that one, and I don't think it much matters which of us is right. Here's a smaller, quieter theory to close on before we get to the actual end of the night, one that's less about plot and more about the geography of the thing, the actual numbered universes colliding into each other. Marketing and leak analysis have floated specific designations for the 3 worlds involved. Earth 616 for the mainline universe, the one Tony Stark and Steve Rogers and everyone from the original Avengers belong to. Earth 10,005 for the old Fox mutant films, and Earth 828 for the Fantastic Four, a number that's on much firmer ground than the other 2, since it was named explicitly, on screen, in dialogue, in First Steps itself, rather than inferred from analysis after the fact. The difference in confidence between those 3 numbers is worth getting exactly right, because it's easy to let them blur together into one tidy list once you've heard them said out loud a few times. 828 is confirmed, stated plainly by the film that introduced it. The application of 616 and 10,005 to this specific collision, and the idea that these are the exact numbers Doomsday itself will use on screen sits more in reported and inferred territory, drawn from trailer analysis and outside reporting, rather than from Marvel's own official materials. It's a small distinction, but I think it matters if you like your theories properly labelled by confidence level, the way I've been trying to do all night. And it should be said plainly, as we start winding down, that none of what we've spent tonight discussing, the incursions, the collapsing universes, the sense that reality itself has gotten dangerously thin somewhere along the way, is actually a brand new idea being introduced out of nowhere for this film alone. It's the payoff of years of scattered setup, threaded rather softly through films and shows that mostly seemed, at the time, to be about other things entirely. Loki's branching timelines, the specific shape of Doctor Strange's spell tearing through reality at the end of No Way Home, a brief, unsettling incursion cameo tucked into Strange's second solo outing that most audiences probably read as a throwaway scare beat rather than a promise. Kang's own exile at the end of Quantumania. None of these were, on their own, obviously building toward this specific film when they first aired, but taken together across years and multiple separate productions, they add up to exactly the kind of unstable, overstrained multiverse that a story like Doomsday needs to exist at all. I find that a really satisfying thing to notice, less because any single piece of it is clever on its own, and more because of how patient the whole assembly turns out to have been, once you finally see all the pieces laid out next to each other at once, at an hour like this, with nowhere else you need to be. Now, before we get to the very end of the night, I want to spend a little time on a part of this cast that tends to get talked about less than the returning legends, which is a shame, because I think it's actually the quieter, more interesting story sitting underneath all the reunion energy, alongside Downey and Evans and the Fox era veterans. This film is also carrying forward the current, younger generation of this franchise, the heroes who spent the last several years inheriting the roles the originals left behind, mostly without a lot of noise. Anthony Mackie returns as Sam Wilson, who by this point, in the story's own internal chronology, has been carrying Captain America's shield for a good while now, handed it directly by an elderly Steve Rogers at the end of Endgame, in a scene that, on rewatch, plays almost like a quiet promise about exactly this kind of moment. Decades of comic book history, essentially telling us the shield was always going to end up exactly here. Letitia Wright returns as Shuri, who took up the Black Panther mantle after her own brother's death, carrying an entirely different, much heavier kind of inheritance into this ensemble. Winston Duke returns as M'Baku, Danny Ramirez as Joaquin Torres, who's taken on the Falcon identity in Sam's place, now that Sam himself has moved up to the shield. It's a lot of characters, admittedly, and I don't think a sleepy viewer at this hour needs to memorise the full org chart of who currently holds which old title. But I do think it's worth sitting, just for a moment, with the shape of what's happening structurally. This isn't simply the original Avengers reuniting for one last job. It's the original Avengers, a set of legacy characters inheriting their mantles, and two entirely separate franchises worth of outsiders, all being asked to occupy the same frame at the same time, which is a fundamentally different kind of ensemble challenge than anything this franchise has attempted before, Endgame included. I mentioned Florence Pugh's Yelena and David Harbour's Red Guardian briefly earlier in the Thunderbolt stretch of tonight, so I won't retread that ground, but it's worth remembering they slot into this same generational picture too. A team of former assets and misfits who by the time this film starts are apparently rebranding themselves as something closer to a proper Avengers lineup themselves. Put plainly, nearly every corner of this cast represents someone either handed a legacy they didn't necessarily ask for, or reclaiming one they'd set down years ago. And I find that a rather elegant piece of structural symmetry for a film that's also, underneath everything else, about old grudges and old names refusing to stay buried, the child inheriting the shield, the actor inheriting the mask, the old Fox X-Men actors inheriting a version of characters they thought they'd finished playing for good. Everyone in this film, one way or another, is being handed something that used to belong to somebody else. Tenoch Huerta-Mejia's Namor belongs in this same conversation, though I'd put him in a slightly different category from the others, since he isn't inheriting anything so much as showing up as his own fully sovereign, fully established ruler. Namor leads Talokan, the underwater nation introduced properly in Black Panther Wakanda Forever, and his presence here means Doomsday isn't only folding in old Fox-era cinema and a family from a separate cosmic corner of the universe, it's also pulling in Wakanda's own recent history, an entire underwater civilization with its own politics and its own reasons for caring, or not caring, about a multiversal crisis playing out on the surface. We touched on his redesigned costume a little earlier tonight, that old comic book homage translated into a modern moisture suit, so I won't go back over that ground again. I only raise him now to point out that even the characters who aren't inheriting a legacy mantle in this film are still, in their own way, carrying an entire prior film's worth of unfinished politics into the room with them. Nobody here is arriving with a clean slate, whether they're one of the old legends, part of the new guard, or the ruler of an entire hidden nation. Everyone's dragging some earlier chapter of this franchise in behind them, whether the room they're walking into is ready for it or not. There are names in this cast list I haven't had room to give proper attention to tonight, and I'd at least like to acknowledge that, rather than pretend the roster ends where my chapters happen to end. Simu Liu's Shang-Chi, who we've already mentioned briefly through his trailer confrontation with Gambit. Wyatt Russell, last seen picking up Captain America's shield for an uncomfortable stretch as US agent before Sam Wilson properly claimed the title for good. Hannah John Kamen's Ghost, a character who spent her own introductory film literally struggling to hold her own molecules together. A cast this size means some perfectly interesting threads simply don't get their own segment on a night like this one, and I'd rather tell you that plainly than pretend I've covered every corner of it. It's worth pausing too on how a film even manages to give that many people something to do at once, since it's a genuine structural problem, not just a marketing one. The Russos have solved a version of this before, and it might be useful as a closing bit of craft talk to think through how Captain America Civil War, their first real attempt at wrangling an oversized cast, solved the problem by splitting its ensemble cleanly into two opposing teams and letting most of the character work happen through which side people chose to stand on, an argument doing the job that individual scenes couldn't afford the runtime for. Infinity War pushed further, scattering its cast across several entirely separate locations and plot lines that only occasionally touched each other, trusting the audience to hold multiple simultaneous stories in their head at once, without a single unifying thread until the very end. Doomsday, based on everything confirmed so far tonight, seems to be reaching for a structure that's almost built in by its own premise, rather than something the writers had to invent from nothing. 3 universes colliding gives you, essentially for free, 3 natural clusters to divide a cast this large across: an Avengers thread, an X-Men thread, Fantastic Four thread, each with its own internal logic, occasionally crashing into each other, the way the X-Mansion battle footage already shows us happening. I don't know if that's actually how the finished film is organised, to be clear, since nobody outside the edit bay has seen a final cut, but it would be a tidy, almost elegant solution to a problem this franchise has, in its own low-key way, been getting better at solving with each attempt, going all the way back to that very first, comparatively modest Avengers film in 2012, when 6 heroes in one room felt like an ambitious stretch, rather than the small, cosy number it looks like from here. If you're still with me at this point, properly still with me, rather than half listening from somewhere just past the edge of sleep, that's lovely. And there's no need to push through the rest just to prove anything. We're close to the end now, regardless. And if you're not still with me, if you went under somewhere, back around the Fox logo, or the Lego sets, or Rebecca Reminds Dreams, good. That was rather the idea of putting this together in the first place. Nothing left tonight needs remembering in the morning. No quiz, no recap, nothing riding on whether you caught every name. There's one more thing I want to say before we let this go for the night, and it isn't really a theory at all, more an observation that kept surfacing every time I sat down with this research over the last while. The same quiet pattern, showing up again and again in completely different corners of the production. So much of what makes this particular film unusual isn't the size of the budget or the number of famous faces crammed into one poster. It's how much time each of those faces is carrying with them into the frame. Robert Downey Jr. isn't simply a new villain. He's a man stepping back into a franchise he closed out by his own character's death many years after he opened it. Ian McKellen and Patrick Stewart aren't just reprising old roles. They're doing it in their 80s, reportedly finding their own light-hearted ways of coping with the demands of the shoot, and by most accounts refusing to treat the whole thing as some kind of farewell lap. Rebecca Romijn described her own body processing the return to an old role through actual dreams, unprompted, unplanned, just something her sleeping mind decided to do with the experience of putting Mystique's makeup back on after so many years away. Chris Evans is wearing a beard from a version of himself several films younger than the version we last saw hand off his own shield. Even Gambit, a character who exists here mostly as one fight scene, is carrying the weight of a solo film that spent the better part of a decade almost getting made and never quite arriving. None of these people are simply playing characters tonight, or rather, whenever the actual film reaches you, they're each carrying some version of their own history back into a story that keeps finding new ways to fold history back into itself. Whether that's an old rivalry from Reed and Victor's college years, a scrap joke about a rookie villain nobody ever got to see, or a piece of unused footage from someone else's film becoming, almost without anyone noticing, the first true frame of this one. I don't think that's an accident of casting so much as it's simply what happens when a franchise runs long enough, gets big enough, and asks enough of the same people to keep coming back to it across nearly 2 decades. Eventually the making of the thing starts to rhyme with the thing itself, whether anyone in the writer's room planned for that or not. But that's the lot, more or less. That's everything I've got for you tonight on Avengers Doomsday, on the mask, the beard, the accent, the Lego set, the leak nobody can quite confirm, and the enormous, slightly chaotic machine that built all of it under a cover name, meant to look like nothing at all. If I had to land on one small thesis to leave you with, out of everything we've covered, it wouldn't be about incursions or Battleworld or who exactly Doctor Doom turns out to be underneath that mask. It would be this: A franchise this large, running this long, doesn't really know how to let anything go entirely. A cancelled villain simply relocates to a different show with a different actor's voice. An old rivalry between a pair of college students turns out, decades later on the page, to belong to two of the most powerful men in their universe. A piece of footage from someone else's film gets quietly repurposed as this one's own opening move. It just keeps folding old things back into new shapes and asking its audience, and honestly its actors too, to trust that the folding means something, even before the story's actually finished, proving it. Which brings me back to where we started, that mask held out at arm's length in a nursery toward a woman who goes very still and doesn't scream. I keep thinking about how quiet that scene is, for something that's meant to kick off the biggest crossover this studio has ever attempted. No music sting, no dialogue, just an old, dented piece of metal, offered rather than worn, and a family that has no idea yet what it's about to mean for them. That's rather the whole film in miniature, I think, at least as far as anyone outside the edit bay currently knows it. Something enormous, arriving without making a fuss, in a room built for putting a child to sleep. There's more of this I want to get to eventually. The actual film itself, once it exists to talk about properly, rather than the shadow of it we've been circling tonight. And there's a great deal more comic book history behind Secret Wars, specifically, that I didn't have room for in this particular sitting. But that's for another night. Sleep well.